Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this episode of Museum Crawl. This is the Newark Museum of Art, and I'm your host, Dar Dwayne. I'm here with my wonderful speaker for today, who's traveled, I guess you could say, abroad. We are going international with the Newark Museum of Art, and so we have our guest speaker, Victoria Osborne, who is visiting us from the Birmingham Museums Trust, UK. And we're going to be delving into the Pre-Raphaelites, the Pre-Raphaelites in a couple of seconds. But before we do, I just want to quickly acknowledge you all just got an award, correct, Victoria?
Yeah, we did. We just found out last night that we won an international award for our exhibition Victorian Radicals, which is about the Pre-Raphaelites and their followers, which is touring the United States at the moment. So that's an exhibition that we organised in partnership with the American Federation of Arts. So we've just heard that that's won an international exhibition award. So we've just heard that. So we'll be announcing more about that in the coming days.
Awesome. I know I'm super excited. Congratulations to you and your team for that award. And that kind of sort of like segues us into what we're here to talk about today. So speaking of the can't even speak. Sorry about that. Speaking of the Pre-Raphaelite, I apologize. When you're so excited about the content, it sort of just bubbles up and comes up, right? I know that the little that I do know about this secret artist community is pretty cool and interesting, but I know that our viewing audience wants to know more. So before we talk about or before we delve into the connections between our museum and your museum's collection, I'm just going to turn the baton over to you so you can sort of delve into the very dynamic pieces you brought to speak on today.
Okay, well, thanks very much for the introduction, Daryl. And hi, everyone. First of all, I want to say a big thank you to the Newark Museum of Art for inviting me to speak today, and to Stephen, Sylvia, Jessica and Daryl for organising and hosting the event. It's really fantastic to have this opportunity to bring some of our collections to you virtually at a time when the museum's doors are obviously physically closed, but we hope to have them open again soon. So I'm talking today about the Pre-Raphaelites, and the reason for that is because in Birmingham we're very fortunate in having the largest collection of works by the Pre-Raphaelites, their associates and followers anywhere in the world. It numbers about 3,000 individual items, and they represent really the whole span of activity of these artists across the whole range of fine and decorative arts. So we have paintings, sculpture, drawings of every kind, but also representations of applied art. So that includes textiles, tapestries, stained glass, ceramics, metalwork, really an incredibly rich and varied collection. And obviously in a short talk like this, I can only really sort of just touch the surface of this amazing collection. But hopefully I can give you a little bit of a flavour of what we have in the collection in Birmingham. So Steve, if we could have the first slide, please. And perhaps the next slide as well, please. Thank you. So the collection in Birmingham, as I've said, it includes over 3,000 objects, and it represents really the whole story of the Pre-Raphaelites and their followers. So from the original Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood in the 1840s through to the second generation who formed around Dante Gabriel Rossetti in the 1850s, led by young artists like Edward Burne-Jones and William Morris, and right through to a third generation of young men and women, progressive artists, often influenced by the arts and crafts movement, who brought the ideals of these groups of artists through into the 20th century and even beyond. I thought for the talk today, what would be perhaps the most useful is to go right back to the beginning of the movement and think about the original Pre-Raphaelite circle, who they were, what it was they were trying to do, and what it was about these paintings that they did that made them look so new, even shocking when they were first exhibited in the 1840s and 1850s. Now, many of the Pre-Raphaelite works, such as, for example, The Last of England, which you can see in the middle of the title slide here, have become among the most famous and familiar and the most popular works in the whole of British art. And in some ways, perhaps it's quite difficult after 170 years to get a sense of just how shocking pictures like this looked when they were first exhibited. But at the same time, the Pre-Raphaelites are artists who still divide opinion. They still provoke very strong reactions in people. And in my experience meeting people as I look after a Pre-Raphaelite collection in Birmingham, they tend to either really love the Pre-Raphaelites or they really hate them, and there's never any middle ground. And I think that the fact that after 170 years, these artists are still provoking such debate and such controversy and still divide opinion so much is one of the things that makes them so interesting as well and so engaging. And one of the reasons why they're still worth looking at and talking about today, nearly 2 centuries after they were painted. So next slide, please. So as this series of talks, Museum Crawl, is about having a virtual visit to museums across the world, I thought it might be nice to start by orienting ourselves in Birmingham. So for those of you who are not familiar with Birmingham, it's a very large city, second largest city after London, in the English Midlands, and Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery is right in the heart of the city. And here it is on a beautiful spring or summer day like today. Next slide, please. So who were the Pre-Raphaelites? The original Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood were a group of young radical British artists who gathered together in London in 1848. There were 7 members of the original Brotherhood, but the 3 figures who were really the leading artists in the group and the ones that most people remember are these 3 artists here. So on the left, John Everett Millais, in the middle, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and on the right, William Holman Hunt. These were very young artists. Millais was only 19 when the Brotherhood was founded, Rossetti was 20 and Hunt 21. And they were all students or had been students at the Royal Academy Schools of Art in London. But they'd become disillusioned with the teaching that they received at the schools and also disappointed and frustrated with the quality of the art that they saw exhibited on the walls of the Royal Academy, which was really the heart of the conservative art establishment in 19th century Britain. The reason that these young artists called themselves the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood is because the art that they wanted to emulate, the art that they admired, was the art of the medieval and early Renaissance period before the artist Raphael, who died in 1520, so pre-Raphael. And at the Royal Academy, they very much promoted the idea of studying from the old masters. And the Pre-Raphaelites wanted to overturn that and go back to a kind of art that they felt was much more real and authentic and genuine. And as we talk a bit more about their ideals, I think it'll become clearer what it was that they meant by that. So Dante Gabriel Rossetti's brother, William Michael Rossetti, looked back on those early meetings of the Brotherhood in the late 1840s, and he remembered what the key aims were that unified that group. And although they didn't have an official manifesto, if you like, Pre-Raphaelites, you can take these aims as a kind of summary of what they were trying to do, so that they're quite helpful. So next slide, please. So this was the first idea, the first aim. We've got 2 now. We only need 1 at a time, but that's fine. So first of all, to have genuine ideas to express. So to make works of art which have something to say, that have something meaningful to express, whether that's a subject from literature, history, or from modern life. And the next one, please. To study nature attentively so as to know how to express these ideas. So rather than copying from the old masters, the Pre-Raphaelites wanted to go back to nature. So if they were painting a landscape, they wanted to get outdoors and really study nature in reality and to work from real people rather than from idealized models or even from classical casts. So about trying to capture reality through studying nature. And the next one, please. To sympathize with what is direct and serious and heartfelt in previous art. The Pre-Raphaelites felt that a lot of what was exhibited at the Royal Academy and in the other exhibitions at the time was very hackneyed, was very conventional. It was more about reproducing what had been done in previous art than actually trying to capture reality or capture a real emotional truth. And so they wanted to get back to something that they felt was genuine, true and heartfelt. And finally, the last one was most indispensable of all, to produce thoroughly good pictures and statues. So they wanted to produce work that was of really high quality as well. So how were these aims expressed in the kind of works that the Pre-Raphaelites actually made? Can we have the next slide, please? This is one of the early works of the young Pre-Raphaelites. This is by William Holman Hunt, and it was exhibited by him at the Royal Academy in 1851. And it was one of a group of pictures that was really savaged in the press, had really terrible reviews, and was one of the pictures that then inspired the influential art critic John Ruskin to write two very important letters to the Times newspaper in London in defense of the Pre-Raphaelites and trying to explain what it was he felt they were trying to do. And that was really an important turning point in the Pre-Raphaelites' fortunes. But this is a subject from Shakespeare. It's from Shakespeare's play Two Gentlemen of Verona, and the picture captures a moment of great emotional drama and tension near the climax of the play, so quite close to the end of the play, in fact. The figure of Proteus on the right, kneeling there in the pink trousers, has just been prevented by his friend Valentine from forcing himself on, from effectively raping the young woman Sylvia, who appears in the middle as the kneeling figure. So Valentine has just pulled these two apart. Proteus is clutching the back of his neck, where he's just been pulled away by the scruff of his neck. Sylvia is very pale and is about to faint. And on the left-hand side, they're being watched by the figure of Julia, who is disguised as a boy. She's disguised as a page, and she's looking on miserably because she herself is in love with Proteus. And behind her back, she's actually toying with a ring that he, her faithless lover, gave her in the past. So you have this moment of great dramatic tension between these four figures. And everything about the way that Hunt paints this picture is about trying to make this feel like a real event that's happening to real people, as opposed to just a theatrical show, as you might see on a stage. So to start with, he depicts it in a real setting. And following this Pre-Raphaelite idea of truth to nature, Hunt took his canvas, he took his easel, and he went out into a real woodland at Sevenoaks in Kent, which is in southeast England, and he painted this real landscape out of doors before then adding the figures in the studio later. So what you get is all of this wonderful detail of the natural world recorded with this almost kind of forensic attention to detail. It's incredibly vibrant and incredibly rich in its surface. Now, he also increases the drama of the scene by having the figures loom very large in the frame, and they feel very close to the picture plane. So when you stand looking at this picture as a viewer, you almost feel like you could reach out and touch these figures. And to increase this feeling of the closeness of the figures, he reduces the recession in the landscape. So he puts the horizon line in that woodland landscape very high in the picture, so you don't have a lot of recession and depth, and that helps to push the figures forwards. And he also has the woodland landscape sloping upwards away from us, which again produces this rather shallow picture plane and makes the figures feel larger and more immediate to us. The same sort of detail that he applies to the landscape is applied to the figures as well. And Hunt actually made, he claimed, or he said, some of the costumes that the figures are actually wearing here, so that he could then paint them directly from life. Now, instead of painting idealized types, Hunt, like the other Pre-Raphaelites, very often painted from people he knew. They were sometimes members of the actual artist group themselves, and sometimes they were friends and associates. Partly because they were cheaper than professional models, but also because you then really had a sense of real, unidealized people. You also have this incredible vibrancy of color, which some critics found really crude and harsh. But you have these amazingly rich purples and reds and pinks and greens. And when these pictures were first exhibited at the Royal Academy, they really knocked everything else sideways on the walls. They made everything else look really dark and gloomy because they had this incredible vibrancy about them. And that in itself made them feel very modern. Now, I've been mentioning about some of the incredible detail that appears in this picture. And if we look at the next slide, one of the things about the Pre-Raphaelites is they didn't pile up detail for detail's sake. The detail within the pictures was all adding to the meaning and all adding to the storytelling. So in this particular painting, if you look down at Proteus's foot here on the extreme right, you can see there are all these mushrooms which have been broken off and are scattered around on the grass. And they're painted like this, not just to show how amazing Hunt is at painting mushrooms, though he is, among other things, but it's intended to suggest that there's been a scuffle, there's been an actual violent confrontation here. And this is the kind of detail that Ruskin really loved, because it was using this truth to nature, but in a way that adds to the meaning of the picture. And if we could have the next slide, please. there's also this idea about trying to create a sense of real emotions, real people experiencing real emotions. So here is Proteus, overcome with guilt and shame and remorse for what he was about to do. And he's rubbing the back of his neck where it's been gripped by his friend Valentine. But I think this gesture is also expressive of his shame. He's always kind of curling up, wanting the ground to swallow him up. And everything about his body language conveys this sense of shame. He's slightly twisted, he's gripping his neck, he's flushed, he's biting his lower lip. And I think Hunt, like the other Pre-Raphaelites, realizes that when people are experiencing extreme emotions, they don't always look graceful and they don't always respond with very sort of beautiful and poised gestures. Quite the reverse, they often look really awkward and really uncomfortable. And it was these sorts of things which made the pictures look very unconventional. These figures aren't behaving like figures in paintings were meant to do traditionally. And so it was one of the things that made them look really different. Now, the final thing on this picture, if we could look at the next slide, I've mentioned about how so often the Pre-Raphaelites painted people that they knew within their pictures. And this particular painting is one of the first appearances in Pre-Raphaelite art of one of the most important figures within the movement, and that is Elizabeth Siddal. And she appears in the role of Sylvia here, right at the heart of the picture. And Siddal is a woman who's very important in the Pre-Raphaelite circle, not only, of course, famously as a model for many Pre-Raphaelite pictures, but subsequently as an artist in her own right, and an artist of great originality and great imaginative power. If we go to the next slide. This is a drawing that Dante Gabriel Rossetti made of Elizabeth Siddal drawing his portrait. You can see that he's sitting there with his feet up on a chair. She's using the back of the chair as a kind of makeshift easel for resting her drawing board on. And she's leaning forward with great intensity and great concentration as she draws his portrait. If we move on to the next slide. Now, in Birmingham, we unfortunately have only one work by Siddal in the collection. She is quite a rare artist. There are some works in public collections, but only one in Birmingham. And it's this drawing. And Siddal is an artist that we're very eager to collect more of her work if we ever have the opportunity, because we're very conscious that at the moment, because of the way that historically the collection has been brought up, we tend to underrepresent the contribution of women to and the role of women within the earliest years of the Pre-Raphaelites. We have a very good representation of women at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century in the arts and crafts movement. But we're much more spotty in terms of our representation of women earlier on in the movement. And we're trying to redress that balance through acquiring works by Rosa Brett, Kathy Maddox Brown, and others in recent years. But Siddal is an artist that we're very keen to acquire more work by. This drawing that we have by her is quite slight, but it's powerful in its own right. It's a study for a picture that was never completed, and the subject is from the Old Testament of the Bible. It's Jephthah's daughter. Jephthah was a commander of the Israelite army who was about to fight the Ammonites, his enemy. And he promised God that if he was given victory in battle, then he would sacrifice the first living creature that met him when he returned home. And unfortunately for him, the first living creature that he met when he returned home was his own daughter. So this is a moment of this terrible kind of emotional dilemma that he has and that she has as well. And she's shown here averting her eyes, but accepting of this sacrifice. He is leaning in and kissing her hand while he grips tightly her other hand in his. And this is very typical of Elizabeth Siddal's style of drawing. These very elongated figures, very angular, rather kind of simplified in these long shift-like garments, but with this real emotional intensity, in spite or perhaps because of the simplicity of the drawing. So if we have the next slide, please. So from the pictures that I've shown you up till now, you could be forgiven for thinking that the Pre-Raphaelites were only interested in subjects from the past, so the Middle Ages or the Renaissance or subjects from the Bible. But one of the things that makes them so interesting is the way in which they engage with modern life. These were not people who were just nostalgic for the past, dewy-eyed, not interested in engaging with their own world. They were very interested in contemporary issues, and they engaged with them sometimes in quite a hard-hitting way in their pictures and in their drawings. So this is an example. This is a painting by Henry Wallace called The Stonebreaker from 1857. And this is a picture that's directly inspired by contemporary events and by a piece of legislation called the Poor Law Amendment Act, which was introduced in Britain in 1834. And it was a way of attempting to deal with issues around poverty and how you support people who can't support themselves. And what the Poor Law did was to oblige poor people who were able-bodied and who wanted support from their kind of local government, if you like, were given accommodation of a sort in the workhouse, and in return for their accommodation, they had to carry out manual work. And the workhouses were such kind of harsh, really brutal places that nobody wanted to go to the workhouse. It was almost better to be on the street than it was to be in the workhouse. And the work that they had to carry out was really harsh, back-breaking work. And one of the things that people often had to do was to break stones to go in the new roads that were being built. And that's what this figure in this painting has been doing. So this is a stonebreaker. He appears at first sight to have collapsed exhausted at his work. He's dropped his hammer. The sun is setting in the background. And at first you think perhaps he's asleep. But then if we go to the next slide, there's a tiny detail just next to his right foot. I've slightly lightened the image so that you can see it better, but there's a little stoat, a little woodland stoat, which is sniffing around his foot. And when you see this detail, you realise that for such a timid creature to be so close to him, he must have been lying there still for a very, very long time. And that's the point at which it begins to dawn that he's not sleeping, he is in fact dead. And so this picture becomes an image of somebody who's forgotten, somebody who's overlooked and has dropped through the cracks in society. And it becomes this very poignant memorial, not just to this individual man, but it becomes a really kind of searing critique of the legislation which is causing so many other people to die these kinds of deaths. So if we come back to the main image again, with the next slide, please. So you have something that initially it looks like it's a beautiful sunset. It's very gentle. It's gorgeous in terms of its colour, but actually it is very hard hitting. And this sunset is not just a sunset, it becomes symbolic of this man's death as well. And it becomes this indictment of this particular piece of legislation and how the poor are treated in society. If we go to the next slide and the last picture that I'm going to just focus on, I want to talk a little bit about perhaps the most famous of all pre-Raphaelite modern life subjects. And I think words like icon tend to get a bit overused, but I think that this is an icon of pre-Raphaelite art, really. This is The Last of England by Ford Madox Brown, which was painted between 1852 and 1855. And Madox Brown, like Wallace, in fact, was never a member of the original Brotherhood, but he very much shared their ideals. And he described himself as an aider and abetter of pre-Raphaelitism, which is quite a nice phrase, because it suggests that there was something slightly subversive about being a pre-Raphaelite artist. So The Last of England, again, is inspired by contemporary events, and it's inspired by the emigration of people from the British Isles to Australia in the 1850s in the hope of making their fortunes in the goldfields. Now, almost 500,000 people left the British Isles between 1851 and 1860 in the gold rush. And 1852 was really the peak year for emigration. And it was an incredibly dangerous and risky endeavour for people. People did give up everything, they left everything behind, and they could be at sea for 3 or 4 months before they got to Australia. And of course, they didn't really know what would happen when they got there, if they would succeed, and even perhaps if they would ever come home. Now, this picture may have been inspired not only by events in the news, but by the fact that Madox Brown's friend, Thomas Woolner, a sculptor and another original member of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, actually left to join the gold rush in 1852. And Brown may in fact have gone to see him off, and that could have been the inspiration for this particular picture. Now, Woolner only spent a couple of years overseas before he came home. And when he came back in 1854, Brown was still working on this picture, which perhaps says something about the amount of time that it sometimes took to create these incredibly detailed pieces of Pre-Raphaelite art. So it's called The Last of England because we have here a couple who are having their last sight of home, and they look with a sort of resignation and kind of trepidation as they set out into this unknown future. In the background, you can see there's a whole cluster of other figures who are traveling with them on the same boat. And they represent different types of people, different characters, if you like. There's a mother with a little boy who's just behind the man there, the little boy's red hair. There's a figure who's really embittered about what he's leaving behind. He's shaking his fist at the coast of England as if to say kind of good riddance. And his mother is gently laying a hand on his arm, trying to get him to calm down. There's a little girl munching on an apple just behind. She's looking right out of the picture at us. And at the heart of the picture are the man and the woman themselves setting out on this journey. And the woman is in many ways the focus of the picture. And the image of the woman is very much informed by the idea of the woman being the heart of the family, the heart of the home, and the thing that kind of holds the family unit together. And she appears almost as a kind of modern day secular Madonna figure. She's got a bonnet around her head that almost acts like a halo, and she holds a child in her arms. You can just see the little hand poking out from her shawl where she holds it in her own hand, and it has a little red sock, a little socked foot that's just sticking out from under her shawl as well. Now, this is a picture that is full of wonderful little telling details, and on the next slide, I've just picked out a few of my favourite ones. So there's the detail of the string that's attached to the button on the man's coat and then attached to his hat so that it doesn't blow away in the wind on the boat. This was almost the last detail that Brown actually added to the picture. You can also see just behind the way that the figures behind the man sort of overlap one another. And it's one of the things that makes this picture feel so immediate and like a snapshot of real life. They're not arranged in a traditional way that you might see in a composition where you can see every figure clearly. It's much more that sense that if you have a snapshot, things are not always neat. Things are sometimes obscured and difficult to read. In the middle, there's an image there of another lovely detail, the sea spray bouncing off the umbrella and actually dropping down and pooling on the edge of the boat there. And on the right is my favourite detail in the whole painting, really, which is the clasped hands right at the centre of the picture, where the wife is holding on so tightly to her husband's hands that it's actually gone white under the pressure. It's such a touching and telling detail, and I think it says so much about the emotions that the couple are experiencing as they go on this journey. So if we go back finally to the picture as a whole. So here we have the whole picture, and you have this this couple who are setting out on this journey, who are modelled, in fact, by Brown himself as the man, and his partner, later his wife, Emma Hill, on the right there. And it's a picture that was very personal to Brown in many ways. He himself, when he started painting this picture, was thinking himself about emigrating and trying to start a new life, not in Australia, but in India, which was then part of the British Empire. And he was thinking about leaving and starting a new life, and because he felt that his artistic career was going nowhere. And actually, it was managing to sell this picture, which was the thing that gave him the kind of both the money and the boost in confidence to decide to stay where he was and to try and carry on making a success of his career. So it's a picture that's very, very personal to him. But I think what makes pictures like this so appealing, there are two things really. There's the incredible detail that they have that makes them so rich and so endlessly fascinating from a visual point of view. There's so much to see, so much to unpick. But I think it's primarily the emotions of these pictures that makes them so powerful. This is a picture that's of a very particular place and a particular time, but it also deals with the universal themes around home, themes around love, themes around family, themes around emotional connection. And they're expressed in such vivid and timeless ways. And I think these are the things that are the reasons that so many people still love looking at these Pre-Raphaelite paintings and why they still have something to say to us 170 years after they were made. So I'll finish there and I'll pass back to you, Daryl.
The works are like breathtaking. I'm just like taking it all in. I can say I think that the idea of resonating with home and love right now is something that we can all sort of gravitate towards. But I do want to delve into the questions. I want to remind our viewers, we do have the Q&A box open. So for all of you who are watching via Zoom, you can put your questions into the Q&A box. And for those who are watching via Facebook Live, you can put your questions in the comment section and we will try our best to accommodate all of those questions. I want to start off first with our first question that we have, which comes in from one of our viewers. And so essentially this viewer says, I studied Victorian art and design when I was a teenager in the early 1970s in Birmingham. The BMAG was a wonder for me, but my art teacher absolutely loathed the Pre-Raphaelites. He thought their paintings were everything that was wrong with Victorian art, sentimental and vapid. So what changed? What changed to make them a poster art or collector's pieces from your point of view? What do you think changed, Victoria?
Okay, well, I think in some ways, some things never changed because there are still a lot of people who loathe the Pre-Raphaelites, and there are still a lot of people who would find them sentimental and difficult. So I think in that sense, it's never changed. But at the same time, they've never entirely gone away. They've had fluctuations in fashion, I think, but they've never completely. There used to be this idea that there was a period where everybody hated the Pre-Raphaelites and everybody forgot about them. But there have always been people who were interested in the Pre-Raphaelites, and there have been fairly regularly exhibitions dedicated to the major figures in the movement. I think it's true that over the last few decades, there's definitely been a sort of an increase in kind of passion and enthusiasm around the Pre-Raphaelites. I don't know if part of that is also around how much easier it is to share images now than it was a few years ago. It's you know, it's always been the case that there were books about Pre-Raphaelites and there were collections that you could go and visit. But I think now it's so much easier for us to see pictures in collections all over the world and to share those in different ways and get in touch with people who share that passion. So I think that certainly has helped. But I think Victorian art has had its own fluctuations, but I think Pre-Raphaelites, because in some ways their work is quite extreme in terms of the colours and the level of detail and some of the subjects that they deal with. They've always, as I intimated earlier on, they've always divided opinion, but I think certainly they're riding on a high at the moment, and yeah, hopefully that will continue.
I would definitely agree. We have a question from Tim. Again, if you have questions for all of our viewing audience, please put those questions in the Q&A and we will get to them. But Tim wants to know, will the Victorian radicals be shown in Birmingham when the pictures return?
It will, yes, it will. We haven't fully fixed when that will be. It'll probably be 2022. But yes, we're certainly planning to show the exhibition when the pictures come back to Birmingham. So that will be definitely something to look out for.
Awesome. Larry wants to know, how long did the movement last?
Well, it depends a little bit about how tightly you define the idea of Pre-Raphaelites. The original brotherhood and the original really tight grouping was probably, it had fallen apart after about 5 years, really, because the artists, ultimately, some of them had quite different aims and directions. So really, by the middle of the 1850s, they're going off in different directions. So the brotherhood's kind of broken down, really, by that point. But you then have this kind of second wave of Pre-Raphaelites. So in the late 1850s, you have Rossetti working with a group of young artists on a project in Oxford called the Oxford Union Murals, where he gathered around him a group of young artists who were all interested in medieval subjects and things like the quest for the Holy Grail. And that's where you get this kind of second wave of Pre-Raphaelites, where you have Rossetti, but you also have Burne-Jones and Morris and Frederick Sands. And I wish I'd had time to kind of delve into them as well, but there's a kind of second wave that happens. And, you know, there is arguably, it goes right through into the 20th century. There's a bit of an argument about who the last Pre-Raphaelite is, whether it's John William Waterhouse or whether it's Burne-Jones, or, you know, if it carries on beyond that point. But it becomes certainly a looser definition of what Pre-Raphaelite is by that point.
Well, we'll have to have you back for that second wave to speak more to that second wave. I'm sure our viewing audience wouldn't mind that. I know I enjoyed this thoroughly. We have a question from Holly, and Holly wants to know, how did the museum obtain such a large collection?
Well, we've been collecting really, the city's been collecting really since the museum was built in the 1880s. There are a number of reasons why the collection in Birmingham is so strong in terms of Pre-Raphaelites. One is because of Edward Burne-Jones, because he was born in Birmingham. and the city was very proud of its association with him. So he was an artist who the city commissioned a major work from very early on and started acquiring his pieces. But also our first director, who was a man called Whitworth Wallace, he knew all of the local collectors in Birmingham, a number of whom had important Pre-Raphaelite paintings, and he sort of made connections with them, and they donated some very important works to Birmingham by the 1890s. So things like The Last of England were in the collection very early on. And as so often with collections, once you have, it's a bit like a snowball rolling, you know, once you've got the nucleus of the collection, it attracts more things. So the other thing that was really important, and something that I wasn't so much able to touch on, was we have an amazing collection of Pre-Raphaelite drawings. And we collected about 1,000 Pre-Raphaelite drawings in the first decade of the 20th century, so between about 1903 and 1906. And those all came from a man called Charles Fairfax Murray, who was Burne-Jones's studio assistant and was an art dealer. And he collected this amazing collection of drawings by Rossetti, Millet, Hunt, and many of the artists around them. And the city bought those drawings from him at a kind of bargain price. So it was like overnight, we went from hardly any drawings to 1,000 amazing drawings. And all of those things together then established the city as a kind of centre for Pre-Raphaelites. And it's something that we've carried on building on ever since. And we're still collecting actively now.
Oh, well, this question from Helen sort of ties back into the question you just spoke to in reference to your collection. So Helen wants to know, of all the collection that you look after in Birmingham, do you have a favorite in the Pre-Raphaelite school, and one that you go back to maybe for inspiration, perhaps?
Yes, I mean, there are lots of things that I love. I tend to love the drawings most of all. There's something very intimate about drawings, because you can really see the artist working out their ideas on paper. So you can kind of have a sense of the artist holding that bit of paper in their hands, and often you can see the ideas kind of taking shape. Particularly if you have a number of drawings for one project, you can kind of see the ideas changing. We have a really beautiful group of drawings by Rossetti for a book of poems by Tennyson, which was published in 1857. We've got 3 drawings for that project. And we have one depicting Saint Cecilia, who's kind of swooning backwards into the arms of an angel. And it's a tiny, tiny little drawing of mine. It's about that big. But it's incredibly intense and detailed, and there's a huge amount of emotion in a very small space. And that's probably my single favorite thing in the collection. If I could take something home, I'd probably.
Well, this next question is probably one that's really close up to my alley. This question comes from Amelia, and she has more inquiries about the controversy behind the collection. So her question reads, hi, thank you very much for the very interesting webinar. You mentioned the movement is still very divisive. What are the main criticisms, and do you agree with any of them?
I think there are a number of things. I think, there are certain critics, I hesitate to name names, there are certain critics
answer, right?
who still write really brutal reviews about Pre-Raphaelite exhibitions. And thinking about the sort of things that those critics might say, I think sentimentality would certainly be one. So a picture like John Everett Millet's The Blind Girl, which is a very famous Pre-Raphaelite painting, which I didn't show in the talk, but it is in the collection of Birmingham, which is a young blind homeless woman with her sister, and they're sitting in a beautiful landscape with a rainbow behind. And it's about the idea of the senses, and it's about the sense of sight, but it's also about the other senses, the fact that she feels the warmth of the sun, she touches the grass with her hands. It's an incredible technical tour de force. It's luminous color, it's incredibly powerful, but I think for some people they just think it's really sentimental, saccharine, and struggle. But equally, there's a picture by Fairfax Brown which is called Pretty Bar Lambs. And it's called Pretty Bar Lambs because the mother in the picture is showing the baby that she's holding the lambs, and she's saying, oh, look at the pretty bar lambs. But unfortunately, because it has that title, I think this is part of the reason, people find that really, it sets their teeth on edge because they think this must be the most sentimental picture. And that detracts from the fact that it's a revolutionary picture because it was painted entirely out of doors in bright sunlight 20 years before the Impressionists in France did anything like that. So it's a radical picture with a really toe-curling title. So there are those kind of challenges to deal with. I think also the visuals of them, some people struggle with the harsh, some might say harsh, intense color and the detail, and they find it too much. I think some people have a very linear view of art, that all the progressive art at that point was happening in France, and therefore Britain, particularly because these artists, a lot of what they did was looking back to the Middle Ages or looking back to the Renaissance. People therefore think they were just kind of young fogies, and they were very kind of, nostalgic for a past, and that therefore meant that they weren't proper modern avant-garde artists. And I suppose the other thing is the classic kind of Rossetti image of somebody like Jane Morris, the type of the sort of Rossettian type of woman that people imagine, very languid, with the hair and the lips and the hands and the neck. Some people are just slightly resistant to those kind of images, and but some people absolutely love them. So I think some of the things that people struggled with early on are still the things that people struggle with. Yeah, they're not always easy, comfortable works to look at, perhaps.
Yeah. Moving into another question from one of our viewers. This one comes from Karen. And she wants to know, is there a historic connection between Birmingham and the Pre-Raphaelites, or was it just the chance that the early curator was a fan, and that's sort of what sprung forth and how you were able to capture such a large collection?
Well, as I say, I think Burne-Jones is very important because he was born in Birmingham in the 1830s. His father was a frame maker and gilder in the town. And Burne-Jones went to school in Birmingham and had his very first art training in Birmingham. I mean, at the time he hated it and he couldn't wait to leave. But later on, he kind of built a relationship with Birmingham again, and he was very encouraged by the fact that in the 1880s, Birmingham was trying to reinvent itself as a cultural centre. It built a new museum, it built a new art school, and it kind of reached out to Burne-Jones to get him involved in the campaigns for those things. And it turned around really his view of Birmingham as a place. He used to think it was a cultural desert, and then he thought, well, actually, they're really trying to change things and they're doing interesting new work and they've got interesting progressive young artists there. So that was important. And so having Burne-Jones on board then helped to kind of create those Pre-Raphaelite relationships. And actually in 1891, there was a big Pre-Raphaelite exhibition that was held in Birmingham. And it was attended by the surviving members of the Brotherhood. So F.G. Stevens came, William Holman Hunt came, and William Morris gave a speech to launch the exhibition. And it's quite exciting, to stand in the museum and think, William Morris stood here giving a speech. So, it was kind of a centre really very, very early on. And a lot of it came about through those personal relationships.
Oh, wow. Okay. Hope that answers your question. So this one is very interesting. This is from Vicky. And Vicky, she thinks this is an insignificant detail, but I think all details and all artworks matter because there's a reason the artist put it there. But Vicky wants to know the final painting. What is hanging off of the net? It looks like an upside down head of lettuce, but she's not sure.
Yeah, it's cabbages. So they took cabbages with them on these long voyages so that you'd have some fresh greenery to eat, you have some fresh vegetables, so that hopefully you wouldn't get scurvy or some kind of unpleasant disease from lack of nutrition on the voyage. And Maddox Brown, being a Pre-Raphaelite and having a real attention to detail, each of those is a separate cabbage. It's like a set of cabbage portraits round the ship. So yeah, that's what they are hanging now.
It's a very significant detail. See, those things matter. Yeah. So moving to our next question, Linda. So Linda wants to know, which is a fun question, were the Pre-Raphaelites the punk rockers of their day, so to speak?
Kind of. I mean, I think you can kind of overstate it, but yeah, I mean, they were very young. I think this is something that is easy to forget, really. They're kind of barely out of their teens, and they were yeah, they were definitely rebellious, and they saw themselves in that way as well. I think they saw themselves as doing something that was really, really new and radical. And I think one of the things that sometimes about when people look at the art, people might think it's a bit earnest and a bit humorless. But actually, when you look again, particularly at the drawings, they were always taking the mickey out of each other, you know, kind of making fun of each other, drawing caricatures of each other, making slightly kind of risque jokes. They are kind of a group of very, very young men with everything that you might think goes with that. So yeah, I think they were kind of young rebels in their own way.
This next question comes from Facebook. So we have a Facebook Live question, and they want to know what influence did Britain's burgeoning industrial growth and increasing social divide have on their art and maybe their thinking?
I think it had a huge impact. I think particularly when you go into the second generation, and if you think about people like William Morris, who had very strong socialist political beliefs, you know, these artists, particularly the ones who were around Morris, had a very strong sense of social justice, and they were very disturbed by a lot of the social impacts of the Industrial Revolution. And part of the ethos behind the arts and crafts movement was about trying, and part of the reason they were looking back to the medieval period was that they saw that as a kind of model of how society could be, because a lot of the impact of industrialization was really negative in terms of the environment, in terms of pollution, in terms of the way that people were living in the modern industrialized cities, but also in terms of the kind of alienation of the people doing the labor. So what Morris wanted to return to in terms of the arts and crafts movement is the idea of people actually being able to do handwork that they could be proud of and that they could feel emotionally connected to, as a part, you know, as opposed to being a kind of very tiny cog in some sort of impersonalized machine where things are just being sort of churned out and you're a kind of dispensable cog, really. So, you know, a lot of that emphasis on kind of going back to hand making is to do with that. I think also the ideas of John Ruskin were very important. I mean, he, you know, he could see the kind of impact on society of this kind of industrialization and the kind of negative effects. And so, you know, they were, some of the artists were more politically engaged than others, but they were certainly aware of what was happening around them. And, you know, you can argue perhaps that it's no coincidence that 1848, the year that the Pre-Raphaelites were founded, it was the year of revolutions across Europe. There were, you know, popular revolts in France. You've got the Chartist riots in Britain, where you've got working men, and it would be men at that point, you know, trying to fight for the vote, protesting for the vote. So, you know, they came about at a time when there's a lot of political unrest and social upheaval, and, you know, arguably that informed what they did and what their concerns were.
Yeah, it kind of draws an interesting parallel to today's times. I'm very curious to see what artists will look at when they look back at a lot of the art that's being created during our current modern times.
Yeah.
So Yvonne has a question for us. And Yvonne wants to know, why do you think the Pre-Raphaelites women's contribution has been so overlooked until quite recently?
I think it's been the case for women artists across a lot of movements in art history. I think there's been over the last, I suppose over the last 50, maybe the last 50 years, a gradual kind of rediscovery and recognition of women's contribution across a whole range of areas, thanks to feminist art historians and thanks, in terms of the Pre-Raphaelites, thanks to the work of a number of really influential scholars, people like Jan Marsh, Pamela Jerish-Nunn, and others who've done really important work in terms of uncovering these women's lives, piecing together their artworks, trying to actually gather together what they actually made. I think in terms of the Pre-Raphaelites, it's not been helped by the fact that for a long time there was a tendency to look at these women as the subjects of the pictures rather than active agents in their own right. So Siddle, partly because of her dramatic life and all of the kind of myths around her and her early death as well, she tended to be seen as this sort of tragic Ophelia-like heroine, you know, this sort of tragic sort of victim figure, and her own contribution and her own artwork tended to be overlooked. And in recent years, I mean, the first show I think dedicated to her was in Sheffield in, I think, the 1980s, but there was a show at Wishock Manor in the Schmidlin's a couple of years ago about her as well. There's a new edition of her poetry that's come out. So I think there's increasing sort of interest in her as an artist in her own right. And similarly, somebody like Jane Morris, who for a long time was seen as you know, as Rossetti's muse. I don't like the word muse, but you get a lot of talk about women as muses in Pre-Raphaelitism. But actually, again, Jane Morris, she was a very creative woman. She was a very talented needlewoman and embroiderer. And the images that Rossetti made of her were often kind of a collaborative process, really, because they would discuss what she would wear. She would sometimes make the garments that she wore. And, you know, we don't know that she didn't have a role in the kind of poses that she adopted as well. So I think increasingly we're trying to kind of draw out the ways in which these women had agency in what they did. I think also in terms of the public collections, often there have been fewer works available by female artists. And now when they do come on the market, I think lots of museums really want those works, and collectors want those works as well, because we're all trying to redress those historical imbalances. But I suppose very often there are fewer of the works that survive. Sometimes they were misattributed. So, you know, there was a lot of that groundwork to be done in terms of establishing, you know, what work there was available. But there was an interesting exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery in London, I think it was just last year, called Pre-Raphaelite Sisters. And that was looking at women's roles across the Pre-Raphaelite movement. So as artists, but ways in which women contributed in other ways as well. So there was a section on Effie Millet, Effie Gray Millet, Millet's wife, for example, who, I mean, she had some artistic talent, but her main role really in terms of the movement was she acted as Millet's kind of business manager. And that in itself is a kind of interesting angle to think about, you know, different ways in which women were part of that movement as well as being artists. So that was a kind of interesting exhibition and an interesting take on the subject.
Yeah, I think those tidbits are always really matter, and it helps sort of make everything come full circle, so you can truly get a better sense of the artist and the artist's point of view. So we only have 10 minutes left, and there are quite a few questions, so we're going to try our best to get to all of the questions. I do have a Facebook Live question that I want to give to you next. This one comes from Jocelyn. So Jocelyn wants to know, was it difficult to achieve the vibrancy of color in the paintings, given that the paint technology what it was at the time? So they kind of have you know, issues creating those vibrant colors we see today, or what could you add to that?
Well, this is kind of an interesting one, because in the 1850s was a time when there were really major developments in terms of paint technology and pigment technology. So there was the discovery of what are called aniline dyes, which are kind of chemically produced dyes, which allowed for incredibly vibrant colors. So a lot of the kind of pinks and greens and purples that you see in fashions of the 1850s were produced using these new aniline dyes. And you get very much the kind of colors that you see reflected in Pre-Raphaelite painting. And I have to say, I had always assumed and thought that Pre-Raphaelite paintings that used those colors were using these new aniline dyes. But I made a note here because I thought that somebody might ask about this. I went to a conference last year in Oxford where a senior conservation scientist from Tate, who's called Dr. Joyce Townsend, did a very interesting paper. And I hope I haven't misunderstood what she was saying here. Perhaps somebody will correct me if I'm wrong. But certainly the impression I got from her talk was that actually, although the colours that they were using in the 1850s looked like aniline dyes, chemical analysis shows that actually British artists were comparatively slow to pick up on that technology, and they only started using them about 1900. So artists in France were actually using them earlier than artists in Britain, which would imply that actually somebody like Hunt in Valentine Rescuing Sylvia from Proteus, which we saw, that those bright colours were produced using the existing technology. But I think it is safe to say that one of the things that makes the pictures like that look modern is the fact that the colours that are used in the paintings reflect the colours that people would have seen in contemporary fashions. So those kind of jewel-like colours were also what people were walking around wearing on the street. So if you look at a picture like Arthur Hughes's The Long Engagement, which again is in Birmingham's collection, where the woman is wearing an amazing purple and green dress. And in the Victorian Radicals exhibition, we are showing that picture alongside some green and purple day dresses of the period. And it suddenly makes sense seeing those two things alongside one another, and you see that they're actually reflecting, what people were wearing on the streets in 1858.
Okay, all right. So again, our time is winding down for all of our viewers. So, like I said, I'm going to attempt to answer as many questions as I can, but I'm scrolling through and I see there are quite a few. So we do apologize for those questions we may omit this time around, and maybe we can capture these questions and be able to respond to those questions via another platform. But I do want to spotlight maybe two more questions before we wrap up. I'm looking at the time. So I have one from an anonymous attendee. And they always said that they associate the Renaissance art with more cartoon-like figures and colors. These don't look very cartoonish at all. So they were looking for help to clear up this misconception.
Yeah, I think colours is certainly part of it, and perhaps a sort of flatness. I think one of the things that I didn't have time to talk about in the talk is the way that Pre-Raphaelite drawing looks back to kind of medieval images. And I think if I'd been able to show some of those, you get a sense that they're quite stylized and spiky and angular and flat in a sense. And so in that sense, they're looking back perhaps to a kind of imagined medieval art, or certainly the engravings that they saw of medieval art, the Pre-Raphaelites. I think in terms of, I think perhaps something that you could look at alongside, say, Hunt's Valentine Rescuing Sylvia, if you look at something like a painting by Van Eyck alongside that, there's not necessarily a kind of cartoonishness, but you have the same kind of clarity of color, clarity of detail, and essentially the Pre-Raphaelites weren't just interested in Italian art pre-Raphael, they were interested in Northern European art pre-Raphael as well. So if you look at works by people like Van Eyck and Memling and Roger van der Weyden, they have some of the same qualities, that sort of extreme level of detail, the people who look like real people, the bright colors. And there was an interesting exhibition at the National Gallery in London a couple of years ago about Van Eyck's famous painting, The Arnolfini Marriage, with the couple in the interior with a little dog. And that was acquired by the National Gallery in the early 1840s, and it had a huge impact on the Pre-Raphaelites. And so you can kind of see a direct, you can kind of see how that kind of painting would have influenced them and be reflected in their work.
All right. So this is going to wrap up our question series. But this last and final question, it comes from Karen, and I'm pulling this question out of the deck because I saw this question pop up a couple of times from a few different correspondents within our chat today. And so Karen wants to know, what is the link between the Pre-Raphaelites and the arts and crafts community? So if you could sort of speak to that connection.
Yeah, well, there's kind of an overlap, really. Essentially, the arts and crafts movement has its origin, I guess, in the early 1860s, which is when William Morris and his collaborators set up Morris Marshall Faulkner and Co., which is the company, sort of decorative art and furnishings company, which turned into what was later Morris and Co. And actually, several of the Pre-Raphaelites were designers working for Morris Marshall Faulkner and Co. So they were making stained glass that was designed by Maddux Brown, by Rossetti, by Burne-Jones. And Burne-Jones stayed with Morris and Co. And became their chief stained glass designer right the way through to his death in 1898. So you have this kind of overlap in that you have this circle in at the beginning of the arts and crafts movement. And there's then a kind of line that takes you through to the kind of late 19th century and the kind of, I suppose, the heyday of the arts and crafts movement. So there's kind of an overlap in that a lot of the figures who are involved with the Pre-Raphaelite movement are also very active in the arts and crafts movement. And there's kind of overlap in terms of their social ideals as well. They're all artists who essentially believe that art can have a role in society and can change the world and can have an effect not only on the people who make the art as well as the people who experience it or use it in the case of the objects that are being made by arts and crafts makers.
And I'm
sure sorry, same interest in kind of truth as well and authenticity. Sorry to talk across you.
No, it's okay. I apologize. I was just going to piggyback off of that and say, I'm sure with both of us working for museum institutions, that we would totally agree with that idea that art, is something that's world changing, and hopefully, not only for the artists, but for the viewers as well. But this kind of sort of brings us to an end. I want to keep going because this was so good. And I enjoyed this so much. So maybe there's a possibility we can maybe have you back. Again, this is our first episode of Museum Crawl. And for those who are watching from home, this is basically our way of being able to allow us to have a cross-cultural exchange in a time where traveling globally is limited due to the pandemic. And this is a series we will hope to continue even after the pandemic. So with that being said, the Newark Museum of Art thanks you for sitting with us and sharing these beautiful pieces. If you ever get a chance to visit the Newark Museum, we have a couple of cool pieces that connect directly, or I say directly or indirectly, to what the material we spoke to today. We have the Ballantyne Mansion. There are a few pieces in our decorative arts collection from the Tiffany window located in the Ballantyne Mansion. This beautiful tapestry located in the mansion as well. And then we have this beautiful painting by of a Moroccan woman located in our Gilded Gallery, which sort of again harkens back to the works of the Pre-Raphaelites. So with that, we encourage you to come visit us when travel is able to I guess happen again, and we definitely would love to come visit you. Are there any final words you want to share with our viewing audience before we wrap everything up?
No, I suppose I just wanted to say again, thank you very much for inviting me to speak and for having me as part of the event today. I just mentioned that for anybody, perhaps in the United States, who's interested in seeing the Victorian Radicals exhibition, it's in the middle of its tour of the States at the moment. And obviously things are suspended at the moment because of the current situation. But it's at the Yale Centre for British Art at the moment while it's closed. We're hoping that the showing there will be extended so that it will be showing there into the autumn, and it will then tour. Let me just check where it's going to next. So it will then go to the Frick in Pittsburgh, to Nevada Museum of Art in Reno, and it will finish at the Museo de Arte de Ponce in Puerto Rico. So if you're near any of those places, I would encourage you to visit. Equally, if you're interested in Pre-Raphaelites, and if you're in the States, Delaware Museum of Art has an amazing collection, and there are great things in the Yale Centre for British Art as well. So there are other places you can see Pre-Raphaelites as well as Birmingham.